Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Hello and welcome to the Walter Bingham File, a magazine in sound that brings you the items from the dinner table talk to the serious subjects that dominate our discussions. It's July 7th, 2020, which in the Jewish calendar is the 15th of Tammuz 5780. And thank you for tuning in. The world is in a new and dangerous phase. The Corona-19 virus is spreading fast, and it's still deadly, and most people are susceptible. We call on all countries and all people to exercise extreme vigilance. This was issued by the WHO, the World Health Organization, warning of a second phase. So who is the World Health Organization? Their expert committee is composed of 13 doctors and pharmacologists drawn from Pakistan, USA, Switzerland, UK, Argentina, Morocco, Tanzania, Ghana, Luxembourg, Sri Lanka, South Africa and Thailand. And the committee is augmented by 4 temporary advisors from India, Switzerland, UK and China. On the other hand, there are many experts who freely offer their opinions and most differ from each other. Some believe in the herd system that allows a large part of the younger population to be infected and produce antibodies, which should then greatly reduce and eventually eliminate the virus. Then there is the view of former Israeli Health Ministry Director General Yoram Lass, who has stated that the coronavirus pandemic is dead, that the virus has been essentially eliminated by antibodies developed by people infected during the first wave. This was the system employed in Sweden and has now been disproved, having regard to the number of fatalities disproportionate to the rest of Europe. Yet Dr. Lass wrote to one of his successors at the Ministry of Health, claiming that more than 1 million Israelis have already been infected by the coronavirus, have developed antibodies, and that this has effectively killed off COVID-19. Lass criticized the Health Ministry's method of testing, which he said has led to a large number of false positives. He claims that their method of testing does not distinguish between active cases of the coronavirus and residual traces of infections that have already passed.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Dr. Lass claims that the Health Ministry's method of testing does not distinguish between active cases of the coronavirus and residual traces of infections that have already passed, and that the so-called second wave largely reflects inactive cases of the virus that cannot infect others. Dr. Asher Salmon of the Health Ministry agreed that hysteria does not help, but neither does complacency, and that comments by Professor Lass could be misunderstood by the public and endanger public health, as some forms of the coronavirus are a very serious disease. The Director General of the Health Ministry, Professor Chezi Levy, is willing to discuss his handling of the epidemic with his critics, but he apparently discounts the theory of Professor Lass to such an extent that he will not sit down with him. The publication of conflicting theories leaves the public further confused about the efficacy of wearing masks and practicing social distancing. Additionally, This is compounded by changing instructions about the closures and openings of different parts of the country. I do not believe that it's possible to confine a whole population group to their closed area. Any determined individual could escape. Only by very strict precautionary measures contained in clear and simple language applied to the whole country for so long as the virus is active or an effective vaccine is found, can we prevent COVID-19 from spreading. There must, of course, also be stringent border controls, including preliminary tests, even at the inconvenience of arriving passengers. They should then have to enter into voluntary quarantine for the prescribed 14 days. Departing passengers should be required to produce a certificate of recent negative tests. It should be noted that South Korea introduced what was considered one of the largest and best organized epidemic control programs in the world, along with Taiwan, Vietnam, and Singapore. Different measures avoiding further lockdown have been taken by them to screen the mass population for the virus and to isolate any infected people as well as to trace and quarantine. The rapid and extensive tests taken by South Korea have been judged successful in limiting the spread of the outbreak without using the drastic measure of quarantining entire areas. But who tells us the truth? The plague is back big time. Watch out for the weak, said former Defense Minister Naftali Bennett. He urges the public to conduct themselves as befitting a second wave of the coronavirus pandemic. The epidemic is back big time. Contagion is very high. We've passed the first wave's highs, Bennett claimed this week. He says just being infected with coronavirus in young people usually works out fine. The problem is when it passes to the elderly. Don't be impressed by the currently low number of sick and dead patients. There's usually a 3-week gap between infection and morbidity and death. So I ask you, when you go out to visit grandparents, meet them outside, in the garden, in the yard, in the open air, urges Bennett. The chance of contagion in the open air is a fraction of what it is in a closed room. If it still has to be indoors, open windows and doors and turn on a fan. The ventilation dramatically reduces the chances of getting infected, he claimed. Don't underestimate coronavirus. It's not a conspiracy, it's a real thing. We don't deny coronavirus, but we can deal with it together, he said. So, who is right? Dr. Lass or the World Health Organization? Or even Naftali Bennett? Is it hysteria or the result of serious research? It's impossible for the public to know. So perhaps the best option for us is to follow the prescribed precautions. I shall now digress in order to say a word about the antics of Mayor Bill de Blasio, whose domain, New York City, with its 8.3 million inhabitants, has so far suffered from nearly 22,000 corona fatalities. Instead of taking serious action to minimize the spread of the virus in his city, he concentrates his attention on the anarchist cancel culture mobs who are determined to destroy New York. The wanton and spiteful destruction of monuments to wipe out the memory of American history, of which many of the perpetrators seem ignorant, appears to be tacitly supported by Democrat de Blasio, who is scheming to invent ways to try and provoke President Trump. He now intends to paint the words Black Lives Matter in large yellow letters on the roadway of Fifth Avenue in front of Trump Tower. This is a childish and futile act that will achieve nothing, as the president would certainly not dispute that statement because he believes that all lives matter. How does such an expense help the city? Mayor de Blasio is married to Charlene McRae, a black lady of Barbadian and St. Lucian descent, who's been described as de Blasio's closest advisor. She chairs the mayor's fund to advance New York City. It is ironic that she looks on while the city's reputation is fast sinking as a result of the current mob rule and steep rise in lawlessness and gun crime. Dozens of police officers are lining up to file their retirement papers, while the city is spiraling out of control. De Blasio's second and final term of office ends in November 2021. Republicans believe that events in the city will bring about a Republican mayor who will put an end to the Wild West atmosphere, restore law and order and the reputation of New York. In the most powerful country on the planet, last month, its people said goodbye to one of its revered sons. Even presidents are not buried like this. A golden coffin, hundreds of thousands of mourners, weeping celebrities kneeling and apologizing to the black population. And the mayor of Minneapolis was clutching the coffin containing the body of the worthiest of his citizens, and his sobs interrupted by cries of, "So sorry." The ex-wife of the deceased wept, requesting justice for him, although according to reports he hasn't financially supported her or his daughter for years. Yet now she is left without a breadwinner. So compassionate citizens of America, and indeed of many parts of the world, donated funds that exceeded $15 million. The North Central University of Minneapolis has established a scholarship in that hero's name. At the memorial ceremony, the university's president, Reverend Scott Haganet, said, "I've been praying all week that this sacred space would become a table of healing for the bereaved family, for the city of Minneapolis, and for the world that is grieving beyond these walls." Yet the nation's celebrant is the criminal George Floyd, who spent varying periods in prison for drug trafficking and armed robberies, including, according to several Minneapolis media reports, holding a pregnant woman by the throat, putting a gun to her belly while demanding money. During the interrogation, he named every one of his accomplices so that his sentence would be reduced. This is America's 21st century national hero. The admiration for Floyd lives and grows. As a mark of respect and grief for their hero, his followers went on a spree of lawlessness, violence, and robberies. It even swept through many countries. Under the slogan "Black Lives Matter," many U.S. city centers were vandalized and famous stores may never return. Police officers were killed or wounded, their cars burned, stores looted, vandalized or torched, and opponents attacked. George Floyd, a black man, was stopped by police for an alleged traffic violation. It must be stressed that Floyd suffered unforgivable torture committed by a rogue police officer who pressed his knee onto Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 36 seconds until he could no longer breathe, which led to his death. This was seized upon by anarchists, criminals, and vandals as an excuse to commit those lawless acts. The mass hysteria even reached the U.S. Congress when Democrat members knelt in the hallowed halls for nearly 9 minutes in memory of Floyd. Did they ever kneel for a fallen police officer, a fallen soldier, a murdered white man or woman, or the thousands of black-on-black murder victims? Have they ever shown signs of mourning for the tens of thousands of elderly people who succumbed to the coronavirus And they were the heroes who defended the country during recent wars. Even the presumptive Democrat presidential nominee, Joe Biden, knelt with a demonstrator at a Floyd protest in Wilmington, Delaware. Why do Democrat leaders prize the life of George Floyd as being more valuable than anyone else's? Perhaps they will place a statue of Floyd on the plinths recently forcefully vacated by Washington, Lincoln, and Columbus.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Siminto from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Siminto, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
And now, some good news. Since April this year, the fate of the new Christian missionizing TV station Shelano TV that aired on the Hot Cable network hung in the balance. The appellants against the granting of a broadcast license to Shelano waited for the decision while the station continued its offensive proselytizing output. Finally, the Cable and Satellite Broadcasting Council has announced its decision. God TV's offshoot will not be allowed to broadcast in Israel, and the Hot TV network must close down Shelano TV within 7 days. The reason given is that God TV, the parent company of Shelano, have misled the licensing authority by stating in the application that their religious broadcasts are tailored for the Christian community, whereas it's been blatantly preaching to Jews. Their aim was to convince every Jew in Israel to accept Jesus as their Savior, which in effect means conversion to Christianity. That did not correspond to the approval given to Shelano, said the Broadcasting Council Chairman Asher Bitton. God TV may, however, reapply for a license by stating the true content of their programming. If that means that the license was only withdrawn for reasons of an untrue declaration and not because of the offensive content of the broadcasts, there would be further objections from many Jewish quarters. The latest news is that God TV does not intend to reapply for the license, but instead sue the Broadcasting Authority. Prior to that announcement, I had prepared the following segment on the law of proselytizing in Israel. You may be surprised or even angry. Missionary activity in Israel is a controversial subject, considered by most as hostile, but there is a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about the law. The Israeli Supreme Court ruled that basic human rights, such as the right of freedom of religion and conscience and freedom of speech and expression, are protected in Israel, since they are an inherent part of a person's dignity as a human being. The exception to this rule is what is known in Israel as the missionary law. This is actually two separate sections of the Israeli Criminal Code. The first law, from Section 174 of the Penal Code, 1977, forbids a person to proselytize another to change his religion by means of material benefit. The second law, from Section 368 of the Penal Code, forbids persuading or seducing a minor under the age of 18 to change his religion. This law also forbids to conduct any ceremony for a minor to change religion without the consent of both parents. In an interesting article, Advocate Joshua Pex An Israeli immigration lawyer writes, and I paraphrase, "The Israeli border control immigration officers who are authorized to approve or refuse entrance to Israel for foreign visitors who wish to enter as tourists have a wide range of discretion. In July 2017, the Ministry of Interior published an updated list of reasons that may cause denial of entrance to Israel, and for the first time, the list included suspicion of missionary activity. Visitors who enter Israel with a tourist visa usually receive approval to stay in Israel for 3 months. They are, however, not permitted to enter any employment, paid or unpaid. In certain circumstances, even after entry to Israel, a tourist may find himself arrested by the Israeli Immigration Police and, following an immigration tribunal decision, may be handed an expulsion order and flown back to their country of origin. These cases usually involve the tourist participating in a public missionary campaign, and such activity may attract resistance from the local public and complaints to the police. With the opening of the new Hebrew TV broadcast station Shelano TV on the Hot Cable channel in Israel, the subject of proselytizing has again received prominence. They are part of God TV in the US with the purpose of missionizing Jesus to Jews. You have already heard some aspects of the law, and because I report and you decide, I intended to bring you today 3 different perspectives on this subject. But as the situation surrounding Shelano TV has changed, I go straight to who was to have been my third guest. I wanted to find out what spreading the gospel to Jews implies and the modus operandi this organization employs. My guest is undoubtedly highly qualified to talk about the tactics of proselytizing Jews to bring them to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and the training required. She is Shannon Newson, a former evangelical missionary who is today a Torah-observant Jew. Now, I know that you live some distance from Jerusalem and therefore deserve special thanks for coming to the studio in these difficult times. You tried to get Jews to Christianity, and as a Christian, you became a Jew. This is surely very unusual. So before you enlighten us about the technique and training of how to missionize Christianity to Jews, would you just briefly tell us the main stations of your eventful life that brought you to this point?
I was born into an evangelical family. My father was an Assembly of God minister. As a teenager, I was trained as a missionary to my peers, and I was very good at it. Later in life, as an adult, I got into more of the Messianic movement, which was Christianity with a Jewish flavor to it, teach Jewish traditions, and they would observe Jewish holidays, which I loved. I liked learning the Jewish traditions behind many of the holidays and the things that Jews do. Learning to evangelize Jews was different than I had learned as a teenager as a typical missionary. For Jews, you needed to learn a little bit more about the Tanakh. Jews seem to be more educated. So I needed to learn the verses that would prove that Jesus was the Messiah if I were to convert any Jews, which is what I did. Unfortunately, I was successful with less affiliated Jews and secular Jews. My problem came about when I would encounter more religious Jews, Orthodox Jews. They seemed to be ready for me. They would taunt me and make fun of me and give me a really hard time. I had my set verses that I had learned in order to evangelize a Jew, and they would tell me that they were mistranslated, that I was taking them out of context, or that they didn't exist, which I thought was absurd.
So at that time, were you already professionally in the missionary work?
Yes, I would say that I was professional, but I would be wrong to tell you that every missionary is trained to become a professional, because every evangelical Christian is themselves a missionary. It is the fundamental belief of Christianity that it is our job as Christians to evangelize the world and the Jew first. So Jews are prioritized.
It's remarkable that as a person who was so indoctrinated, so steeped in the belief that to convert Jews is carrying out God's will, you managed to extricate yourself from this community of missionaries. How did your ingrained lifestyle allow you to escape?
The Orthodox Jews that I would encounter, they would make fun of me. And it was clear that I was going to have to learn a lot more than just the verses I had learned in order to convert them, that I was going to need to really know my Bible. Because I would bring up one verse like Isaiah 53, and they would ask me, what's Isaiah 52 say? Or what's Isaiah 49 say? And of course, I had only learned the one verse that I was taught that spelled out Jesus to a Jew. I didn't know all of the surrounding verses. So I went back and I thought, I'm going to have to learn everything, and I'm going to have to learn every verse, and I'm going to have to learn every chapter or the whole book if I have to, in order to really reach these Jews. Because as a Christian, I was very sincere in my love for Jews, so I really wanted to accomplish bringing them to Jesus, because that was, to me at the time, it was like the ultimate mitzvah. So in the process of learning more, things began to really fall apart and didn't make sense to me at all, because I had learned that this verse means the fulfillment of this prophecy, and then this verse means the fulfillment of this prophecy. So when I was learning the entire chapter and all of the surrounding verses, or the entire book, things really started falling apart, and I felt really stupid. I wasn't sure why it was falling apart, because I had no doubt that Jesus was the Messiah. But when I went back and learned the entire book, it really fell apart. I went to my pastor, I went to teachers with my questions and things that didn't make sense, and I kept getting the same answer, and they weren't able to explain it to me. But they ended up saying, "You lack faith," which to me was offensive, because I had lived and breathed my faith my entire life. I was a preacher's kid. When the doors of the church were open, I was there. I may not understand something, but I did not lack faith. So my next plan was, if I couldn't make the text work, that I'm going to learn the Jewish response to Christian missionaries. And if I learn how they respond, then I'll learn to debate them. I'll reach them and bring them to Jesus. So I went searching out, how do Jews respond to Christian missionaries? I found a rabbi that had teachings that were free online, and I started doing those. Then my whole world fell apart. Everything I believed was wrong. The Jews were right. It was a crisis that I was going through. It was very emotional. It probably sounds very strange to a Jew, but to me, even though Jesus is like an imaginary friend, it was somebody who was one with me and that I walked with and talked with every day. It was part of my life, and it was everything central to everything I was.
So what was it that finally turned you to Judaism?
I had always thought that the Bible that I was reading was true. The words were from God himself, heavenly inspired, and that every word was absolutely true. When I found out that the verses were purposely mistranslated and that there was things in there that was an obvious agenda, that infuriated me, that the church had done that. That was very upsetting.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
We live in the age of information, but not inspiration. If you're like me, you're looking to be inspired to reach higher, to connect more, and to grow. Well, if you want to get warm, you need to stand close to the fire. And if you want to catch fire, you need to stand close enough to get hit by the sparks. Join me, Penina Taylor, as we walk with people who have embarked on a spiritual journey towards Torah. We'll uncover what started them on their journey and what truths they discovered along the way. So prepare to be inspired as we take a leap of faith every Sunday at 5 p.m. on Israel News Talk Radio.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
When I found out that the verses were purposely mistranslated and that there was things in there that was an obvious agenda, that infuriated me, that the church had done that. That was very upsetting. I think I went through every stage of grief. There was intense anger, then there was sadness. Everything that was central in my life, my friends, my family, everything I do every day was gone. Suddenly had no purpose in life. It was very devastating. So at first, it was the scriptures themselves, seeing that they didn't make sense. What I was learning didn't exactly show that Jesus was the Messiah, and maybe didn't even exist. For a while, I went through a difficult time of feeling there is no God. I had given up on God. I decided to speak out directly to the rabbi whose lessons I had been learning, and somehow he got through to me. So he'd said if I could put Jesus aside, that God was still very much there for me, and he loved me. And from that point on, I decided I was going to study to learn the original Hebrew of the text, and I was going to learn all over, like a child going through Jewish day school, and that I wanted to learn the truth and beauty of Judaism. Once I had decided that Judaism was the path that I wanted to take, I went first to a Reform synagogue, then fairly quickly went to a conservative synagogue and started learning there. But I had attached myself to Eretz Sheva, which is where I first encountered you, Walter, and the Jewish people and different teachers that were teaching from Israel.
You were still in the United States at that time?
Yes, I was, throughout this process. So I began the process in 2005. I entered the formal conversion process probably in around 2006, 2007. I finished a Orthodox conversion in 2009. I began going to a Reform synagogue, and because I was learning online through Eretz Sheva and Aish Chabad, I was very hungry to learn more, and the Reform synagogue and the conservative synagogue seemed more like a social group. People there didn't have the answers that I was looking for. It was clear that I needed to really delve into learning much deeper. So I connected to Chabad that was nearby, and that was how I began the Orthodox process.
Would you like to say something about the reaction of your family to your decision to convert to Judaism?
My father had come to my home during my learning, and I had usually turned things backward and didn't want him to see the Hebrew. He came over one day and saw everything that I was learning out on the table, and he told me, we need to sit down because I see what you're looking at, and I see that you've changed the way you dress, you changed the way you eat. I know this. You're getting involved in a cult. He said, we need to learn together, and I need to bring you back. That was great because I had a lot of questions. And maybe he could help me, and maybe he could bring me back. I asked my father to listen to the same lessons that I had learned from this rabbi. So he agreed and look at the same material that I had learned. We agreed not to speak about it again until he had. He stayed at my house that night, and I actually heard the rabbi's lessons in the other room. He was listening to it, and he knocked on my door at 3 o'clock in the morning and sat at the end of my bed in this catatonic state. And I asked, Daddy, what's up? And he said, that man is right. I took my Bible in there and I tried to tear apart everything he said, but he's right about everything. The Jews are right. And he looked at me and asked, what do we do now? I eventually chose to convert Orthodox. My father decided not to do a conversion. He said he was too old to learn a new language, a new culture, a new religion. So he became a Noachide.
Are you saying that you actually brought your father nearer to Judaism?
My father left Christianity because of the learning that I had done, yes. He chose to be a Noachide, but he is very close to Judaism. He's very close to Jews. You can see him writing on social media about Israel and defending Israel. He's been to Israel quite a few times. My mother was a little more difficult. I thought she'd be understanding because she had been through the Messianic Church and understood the Jewish traditions. The teaching in Christianity is that if you don't accept Jesus, you're going to hell. That's very heavy and very difficult for a mother to go through and feel that their child is going to hell. And I have children, so I was going to hell and I was taking her grandchildren with me. Very difficult. But at the same time, you have to understand that you can't go out to eat together. You can't celebrate holidays together. Your entire lifestyle changes, which affects not just you, but your entire family.
You converted while you already had children. How did that affect the children, and what became of them? Did they become Jewish?
I had 2 children. My daughter was 10, and my son was 4. They were very young. Their conversion was automatically accepted under my conversion because they were so young, and they loved it. They clung to it right away. My little 4-year-old son had long payos, and he was the rabbi in our home. They went to Jewish day school. She since went to seminary. They're both in Israel. My son is about to join the IDF.
In the last part of this program, I want to come back to proselytizing to Jews. What is the modus operandi of the missionaries? Because I believe that missionaries work by stealth and surreptitiously lead their chosen target into their net. What criteria do they employ to select their targets?
Well, of course, the unaffiliated and the less educated Jew is easier to prey on, but really, they were all our target. As far as deceitful tactics, we didn't feel it was deceitful. It's called friendship evangelism. You friend a Jew, and you become close to them, and you share day-to-day life with them, and you wait until they ask you, and then because you're not approaching them directly. Right. There are different types of missionaries. There are ones that are in your face, that are carrying a microphone around Ben Yehuda Street and giving out tracts and in your face. And then there's the everyday person you'll encounter on the street that's just friendly and offers you something or befriends you in some way. In Texas, we were instructed to become part of the Jewish community in different ways. I would go to the JCC and volunteer for events. I would be a greeter at many of their events and meet people, attend any of the conferences or the rallies or anything that was taking place. And I became very friendly with many Jews and became a very familiar face. So you gain credibility and their friendship.
All I hear from Christians whom I meet, we love Israel, he who blesses Israel, etc. We are visiting here because we love your country. And no, we don't want to proselytize. It sounds very convincing, and after all, we encourage Christian tourism. But can I trust those sentiments? Or should I view every evangelical Christian visitor to Israel as having a deep-seated ulterior motive?
Unfortunately, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound so nice. And it's about perception. To you, it's an ulterior motive and evil and sinister, and it's a lie. But to a Christian, it's very much the opposite. They are coming out of a place of very sincere love. And even though they are being deceitful, they are told when you see somebody in a burning building, you're going to save them no matter what. And even if you have to take them kicking and screaming and explain to them why you're doing it later, you're going to save them from that situation. They're doing it out of a place of love and concern. As far as the ones that say that they don't proselytize, I have not heard them come out directly and say, I don't proselytize. They have a very sneaky way in wording it. They will say, we don't believe that a Jew has to convert to Christianity. And they say that in honesty. They don't believe that you have to convert to Christianity. They want you to stay completely Jewish. They want you to keep all of your culture and your traditions. They just want you to accept Jesus as the Messiah. They don't see that as converting to Christianity like you and I would.
Are you still active in countering Christian proselytizing to Jews?
I do not consider myself a counter-missionary. Gabrielle Sanders and I work together. We've coined the term a missionary awareness consultant. What I've done for the last 10, 15 years is monitor missionary organizations that are operating in Israel. We monitor their activities, who they're involved with, and we work with government and Jewish organizations on the partnerships that they form with them. We get asked to verify what the belief is of certain organizations, and our hope is that Jewish organizations, when they form these relationships, can set up proper boundaries and guidelines to dictate how these interfaith relationships should go about. Because the evangelicals have a very strong foothold here in Israel and have infiltrated just about every part of our society. We've found it difficult to put up proper boundaries. It has been a big open embrace of everything Christian lately.
Well, that's become even more prominent now that the new Shelano TV station has opened. How shall we deal with them?
Well, this God TV situation is a very serious matter that really needs to be addressed. Their goal is to get into every Israeli home and to preach the gospel to every Jew and to bring every Jew to salvation in Jesus. And he quotes over and over again, 9 million Jews in Israel need Jesus. So he's not excluding children or elderly. He means everybody.
As you will have heard, their license has now been revoked, and that is discussed in another part of the program.
Biggest problem that we encounter in this argument is the American perception of freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And I think in that regard, we need to realize that America was founded with Christian values. They were founded very differently than Israel was founded. Concept of religious freedoms here in Israel is going to look very different than that in America. In fact, I think it is the government's responsibility to protect every Jewish person and the identity of Jews as a whole. As far as religious freedom, everybody in Israel is allowed to live and believe whatever they want to believe. There's absolute freedoms in that we have every major religion represented here in Israel. But there is a red line that should not be crossed, and that is when you target and prey upon a people, that needs to be protected.
Shannon Newson, keep up your valuable work, and thank you very much for your time. Last week, constrained by the laws of the coronavirus, the annual LGBTQ march through the holy city of Jerusalem could not be held in its usual form. Instead, their members and supporters gathered in Independence Park for one of the largest parties ever to have taken place there. Masks and social distancing were scantily observed for obvious reasons. This feast for the lesbians, homosexuals, bisexuals and transgender crowd has grown into unprecedented proportions of Israel's from interviews. People of all stripes, whether black or white, religious or secular, politically on the left or on the right, have a right to practice their sexual preferences so long as it is within the law and does not inconvenience or embarrass the rest of the population. That also applies to the heterosexual spectacles one sees on our beaches. But for LGBTQ people, to display their sexuality publicly as if it were an asset to society is distasteful in the eyes of a large part of the population who consider it provocation. Even so, it does not justify the harassment to which they are often exposed, but they could easily avoid this by conducting their daily life without deliberately drawing attention to their sexual preferences by, for instance, displaying rainbow flags in their windows. No one would care what they do in private. And what is the point for the 6 homosexual members of Knesset to make their sexuality public? One can choose to advocate for the rights of one or another deserving group without declaring any personal involvement. And I've yet to understand the reason for their pride, as in Pride March and Pride Week, etc. If heterosexuals would draw attention to their lifestyle in the same way, the PR machine of the LGBTQ community, as they like to describe themselves, would quickly claim discrimination. It's interesting that they are a relatively small number compared with the total population, yet they make more noise than the rest of us together. It's also apparent that the largest number of this community are on the political left. We always see their rainbow flags at demonstrations for the Palestinian Arab cause, and there is invariably one of their speakers on the platform. Yet the very people whom they try to defend do not accept their creed and would no doubt physically attack them if they would dare and march through or try to demonstrate in Arab areas. And finally, did you know that there is a long-standing U.S. Supreme Court ruling to the effect that neither the Constitution nor state law impose a general duty upon police officers or other government officials to protect individual persons from harm, even when they know that harm will occur. Police can watch someone attack you, refuse to intervene, and not violate the Constitution. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that the government has only a duty to protect persons who are in custody. And with that surprise, I've come to the end for today. There was certainly much to mull over. God willing, I'll be back again next week with another program of news, views and interviews from Israel and the rest of the Jewish world. Until then, this is Walter Bingham wishing you a safe and healthy week. And as there seems to be a second wave of the corona and the elderly will again be housebound, see what you can do that your elderly neighbors are taken care of and have what they need. It could be one of your parents or grandparents. Thank you. Goodbye.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.